The sun dipped low behind the rust-red hills of Dust Hollow, casting long gold-tipped shadows over Elias Harper's brittle fields. Another day was ending, dry and fruitless. His boots crunched over parched soil as he trudged along the fence line, checking for broken rails, though he wasn't sure why anymore. The rains hadn't come in months. The corn had withered in its rows. His cattle had been sold off the month before to keep the bank from taking the last of his land. All that remained was his stubborn pride and a promise he'd made to his late wife, Anna, to hold on just one more season. That's when he saw the figure. At first, he thought it was a shadow or maybe the ghost of a coyote slipping through the tall grass, but as he narrowed his eyes and stepped closer, Elias realized it was a boy, thin, barefoot, barely more than a silhouette against the glow of the dying sun. He stood at the edge of the field, just past the barbed wire, motionless. He didn't look like he was trespassing or planning to. He just stood there, arms at his sides, watching. The boy couldn't have been older than 16, though he looked worn well beyond his years. His hair was black and shoulder-length, tangled and caked with dust. His skin, the color of sun-baked earth, was scraped in places, and his cheeks hollowed from days without food. His shirt was torn open along one shoulder, revealing a bruise that reached from collarbone to bicep. His lips were cracked, and his eyes, those tired, sunken eyes, held neither fear nor defiance, just exhaustion. Elias instinctively reached toward the old rifle slung near the porch steps, but paused. The boy hadn't moved. He didn't flinch. He didn't beg or speak. He simply looked at Elias as if waiting for some kind of judgment, too proud to ask for help, to warn, to run. Elias glanced toward the house, then back at the boy. He remembered a winter years ago when a traveler from up north had collapsed in the snow just outside their gate. Anna had found him, blue, with cold, and brought him inside without hesitation. Kindness is never wasted, she'd told Elias while heating broth over the fire. Not in this world. With a grunt, Elias raised his hand and gestured. Come on, over. The boy hesitated, then stepped lightly over the boundary as if unsure whether this was a trap or a miracle. Elias led him to the porch, where an old bench sagged with age but still held weight. He ducked into the kitchen, retrieved the last of his cornbread from a tin, and poured water into a dented tin cup. It wasn't much, half a loaf, dry around the edges, but it was all he had left from the week. No butter, no stew, just the bread, in the hope that tomorrow he might find some work in town or finally receive a letter about his overdue loan. The boy took the food with both hands. Careful, reverent. He didn't wolf it down as Elias expected. Instead, he ate it slowly, almost ceremonially, savoring each bite like it was sacred. Elias sat across from him on the porch step, sipping weak coffee and watching the last light fade over the ridgeline. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, the boy whispered, "Thank you." Elias nodded. "You got a name?" The boy paused, then murmured, "Nant," and Elias recognized the word I'd meant leader in Apache, if he remembered right, but he didn't pry. There was a dignity in the boy's silence that reminded him of how Anna used to say, "Some things are best not questioned, just respected." "You can sleep in the barn," Elias said after a moment. "Plenty of hay in the loft. Gets cold at night." Nantan looked at him, surprised. "You sure?" Elias gave a tired shrug. "Ain't no one else askin' to stay." The boy gave a nod, not a grateful one, but a solemn one, like an agreement between equals. Then, cradling the blanket Elias handed him, he disappeared into the dusk, his bare feet silent against the dirt path. Elias watched until the barn door creaked shut behind him, then turned and looked out across his land, dry, cracked, and lifeless. But, for the first time in months, he didn't feel entirely alone. The old kitchen smelled faintly of coffee grounds and wood smoke. Elias Harper stood at the chipped enamel sink, rinsing his tin cup with a trickle of water from the rain barrel outside the window. There hadn't been proper rain in weeks, and he used every drop like it was gold. Behind him, the wind creaked through the wooden slats of the porch as dusk settled in, quiet and blue. He could hear the boy out there in Enton still chewing slowly, methodically, on the piece of cornbread Elias had given him. Not ravenous, not wild, just controlled, like someone who'd learned how to stretch even a single bite of food to last. Elias watched him through the screen door, arms crossed. The boy sat with his back straight despite the exhaustion in his shoulders, his eyes scanning the horizon between bites. His movements were calm, deliberate, not the kind of posture you expected from someone half-starved. Elias had seen enough men in need, miners, drifters, even desperate townsfolk, to know that hunger usually stripped away pride. But this boy had something else holding him up. He wasn't just surviving. He was carrying something within him that kept him from breaking. The cornbread was stale and crumbling, but Nantan ate it with reverence. He cupped the tin of water in both hands, sipping gently, as if afraid to finish it too quickly. Elias figured he must have gone days without a real meal, yet the boy didn't ask for more, didn't beg. He didn't even ask to stay. Elias respected that kind of quiet dignity. It reminded him of the elders from his childhood, those old Lakota and Mexican men who used to pass through town once a year, wrapped in blankets in silence, teaching with their eyes more than their mouths. When the boy finished, he looked down at the crumbs in his palm and gently brushed them onto the porch floor, not wastefully, just respectfully. Then, without meeting Elias's eyes, he spoke again. I didn't think anyone would help. Elias sat down beside him, his knees cracking. From years of farm work, most folks wouldn't, he admitted. Towns turned hard. People see a boy like you and think trouble, not child. Nantan didn't respond, but Elias saw a flicker in his expression, something between understanding and sadness. The silence stretched between them. Cicadas buzzed in the fading light. A coyote howled faintly in the distance, answered by another. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What happened to you? The boy hesitated. His fingers curled slightly, and for a moment, Elias thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, voice barely above a whisper. I went into town to find food. My sister, she's sick. I thought maybe I could work or trade, but some boys, they saw me, said I was stealing. They beat me, took my knife, my bag. Elias felt his jaw tighten. He could imagine exactly who would have done it. Probably the same group of idle young men who spent their days at the saloon, blaming their empty lives on anyone with darker skin or a different tongue. He shook his head. That don't surprise me one bit. I didn't fight back, the boy said. I couldn't, not alone. You shouldn't have to, Elias said firmly. Not a boy your age. Nantan looked at him then. Really looked, his eyes full of an emotion Elias couldn't quite place. Gratitude, yes, but also curiosity. Maybe even confusion, as if the old farmer's kindness didn't fit into the world he knew. Why'd you help me? Nantan asked finally. Elias leaned back in his chair, staring at the stars beginning to emerge in the purple sky. Because you were hungry, he said simply. Because my wife would have skinned me alive if I didn't, and because you're still a child. Even if this world's trying to turn you into something else. The boy nodded slowly, as though filing the words away. He glanced toward the barn. You can sleep in the hayloft tonight, Elias said. Safe, dry. There's a wool blanket on the hook. Ain't much, but it's warmer than out here. Nantan stood and bowed his head respectfully. Thank you. Elias watched him walk toward the barn, his steps slow but steady. The blanket tucked under one arm. When the wooden door creaked open and shut behind him, the old man finally exhaled. He turned back toward the kitchen, the night chill settling in. There was nothing left in the pantry. No meat, no eggs, just some flour and a few onions. Tomorrow, he'd have to ride into town, try to barter for what little he could. But somehow, the emptiness in his cupboard didn't feel as heavy tonight. Maybe because he'd shared it. Maybe because he wasn't the only one fighting to survive. Or maybe because for the first time in a long while, someone had looked at him not with pity, but with trust. The night rolled in with a hush that only the desert could command, a quiet so vast it pressed against the windows, filled with the sighs of wind and the brittle songs of crickets. Elias Harper sat at the old pinewood table in his kitchen, the lantern burning low beside him, casting long shadows across the room. He cradled a tin cup of weak coffee between his calloused hands, staring down into the dark liquid as if it held answers to questions he hadn't yet dared to ask. The boy Nantan was asleep in the barn, or so Elias hoped. He hadn't heard a sound from outside since the barn door creaked shut an hour before, and yet, something felt off. Not dangerous, just charged. Like the air before a thunderstorm, only the sky above was clear and painted in stars. He couldn't explain it. It was the kind of feeling you didn't learn in books or from sermons. It came from the soil, from seasons of knowing when the land wanted to speak. Outside, the wind began to pick up, brushing against the walls of the farmhouse like invisible hands. It wasn't a violent wind, but it had rhythm, a rising, sighing cadence that made Elias pause and tilt his head. The desert had many voices, coyotes yipping in the distance, owls calling from saguaros, the mournful moan of wind through dry brush. But this was something else, something ancient. He set the cup down gently and walked to the front door. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots. When he opened it, the screen groaned slightly, and a gust of warm air slipped in like a whispered warning. He stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed over his chest, eyes sweeping across the horizon. The moon hung low and full, casting a silver glow over the lifeless cornfields. The crops were mostly gone, stalks shriveled and bent, victims of a relentless drought and soil grown tired. But in the moonlight, the field shimmered oddly, as if the shadows themselves had weight and movement. Elias squinted, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching him. Not threatening, just aware. A sudden rustle made him turn. It came from the barn. He reached instinctively for the old rifle propped near the doorway but didn't lift it. A moment later, he saw a figure small and slow step out into the open. It was Nantan. The boy moved like someone drawn by instinct rather than thought, his blanket wrapped tightly around his shoulders. He looked up at the sky, then toward the hills beyond the fields, and stood still, like he was listening for something far away. Elias remained quiet, not wanting to disturb whatever was unfolding. There was a reverence in the boy's stillness, a kind of prayer that needed no words. And then, Just on the edge of hearing, Elias caught it too. Hoofbeats. Faint, distant, and rhythmic like a drum echoing from the far side of the hills. At first, he thought it might be his imagination, stirred up by the wind and the boy's presence. But the sound grew louder, steadier, rolling like thunder swallowed by sand. Nantan turned then, his eyes catching Elias's in the moonlight. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply gave a small nod, as if confirming something long expected. Elias stepped off the porch, walking across the dry earth until he stood beside the boy. They listened together, side by side, staring toward the hills. The hoofbeats were real, now real and many, too many to count, and they were drawing closer with purpose. Who's coming? Elias asked quietly. Nantan's gaze didn't waver. Family? Elias turned slowly to him, questions beginning to rise. But something in the boy's voice silenced them. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The farmer looked out again, across the open land, heart thudding not with fear, but with a kind of awe. The wind carried something ancient that night, something far older than barbed wire and county lines. It felt like the land itself had stirred from slumber, as if it had seen a moment of kindness and now answered in kind. By the time Elias returned, inside, he could still hear the hoofbeats approaching beneath the stars. They came not like a threat, but like the tide, inevitable, powerful, and deeply alive. He left the lantern burning low on the windowsill, just in case those riding through the night might need a light to guide them. The sky had only just begun to pale when Elias awoke. A chill ran through the farmhouse, not from cold, but from a stirring in the very bones of the land. He wasn't sure what had pulled him from sleep. No rooster had crowed. No wind had slammed a shutter, but something had changed. Something was outside. He swung his legs out of bed and tugged on his boots. The smell of dust and sage came through the cracks in the window, thick and rich. The old house was still quiet, the walls groaning only slightly as they always did before dawn, yet there was a pulse in the air, a beat that seemed to echo from the earth itself. He opened the door slowly, and the porch creaked beneath his step. What he saw rooted him in place. They were everywhere, across his barren fields, like ghosts. Rising from the soil, stood men, dozens upon dozens of them, silent, proud, still mounted on horses and standing on foot. They stretched from one edge of his property to the other, forming a living barrier between the land and the hills beyond. Some were young, lean with alert eyes. Others bore the markings of elders' braids dusted with gray eyes, lined with the weight of history. Spears, bows, rifles, slung across backs, but no weapons drawn, at the head of them. On a pale buckskin horse, sat a tall man with a feathered staff in one hand. His face was lined, but strong, his gaze sharp and steady. Beside him stood Nantan, blanket still around his shoulders, though now the boy's posture had changed. No longer hunched, no longer worn. He stood with the quiet confidence of one who belonged. Elias saw now how Nantan's head was held high, his eyes clear. The weight he had carried the night before was not just hunger, it had been the burden of a messenger. Elias stepped off the porch, the dry grass crunching beneath his boots. He didn't raise his hands or call out. He simply walked toward them, one man facing 200. The tall rider dismounted without a word, passing the reins to a younger man beside him. He walked forward, his movements smooth and deliberate. As he approached, Elias could see beads stitched into his vest, a turquoise pendant at his neck, and a deep scar that ran from his left cheek down to his collarbone. His eyes, like held no threat, only a deep and enduring strength. He stopped a few feet from Elias and spoke, his voice low and even. "You gave bread to my grandson." Elias looked from the man to Nantan. The boy's face revealed nothing, but his eyes softened slightly. "I did," Elias said. "He was hungry." The man nodded once. Many saw, the earth saw. Elias glanced around at the warriors. None moved, none spoke. Their presence wasn't loud, but it was overwhelming, like standing in the shadow of a mountain. "I didn't do it to be seen," Elias said, clearing his throat. "Just figured it was right." The man stepped aside and gestured to the field. "This land is tired, but not dead. We can help." Elias frowned. "Help? How?" Behind the man, several of the warriors dismounted and began walking toward the edge of the field. They didn't wait for instructions. Some pulled tools from saddlebags, hand-forged hoes, rakes, picks. Others moved toward the well, examining the old pump. A few peeled off toward the barn. Within minutes, the dead silence had transformed. Men were tilling soil, clearing rocks, digging trenches. A group worked together to lift and reset a collapsed fence. They moved in harmony, like an army that had long ago learned the power of working as one body. Elias stood in stunned silence, watching as his dry, broken land was brought to life. Nantan approached and stood beside him. "We do not forget kindness," he said softly. "We give back what was given." But this Elias looked across the land, overwhelmed. "I gave him one meal." Nantan nodded. "One meal in hunger is worth more than gold." "You gave him dignity, shelter, hope." "We give thanks not in words, but in labor." Elias swallowed hard, his voice catching. "I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Nantan replied. Just let us work. And so, as the sun crested over the eastern ridge and bathed Dust Hollow in golden light, Elias Harper stood in the middle of a miracle, his fields alive with motion, his land touched by hands that worked not for pay, but for honor. The wind carried songs, narrow, rhythmic chants, rising from the men as they worked, songs of the land, of ancestors, of debt repaid in full, and Elias, for the first time in years, allowed himself to believe in something again. As the sun continued its steady rise above the jagged horizon, the farm became unrecognizable. The same land Elias Harper had nearly given up and dirt, cracked like old leather, weeds tangled like wire, was now moving with rhythm and purpose. Rows that had once lain dead and forgotten were being turned over by skilled hands. Where Elias had seen failure, the warriors saw potential. Elias walked slowly among them, boots sinking into softened soil, his wide eyes taking in every motion. These men didn't just work the land, they understood it. Every gesture was purposeful. A man with silver streaks in his hair leaned down and ran his fingers through the dirt, muttering something in Apache before nodding toward a group to start a channel for irrigation. Another group dismantled Elias's rusted chicken coop with quiet efficiency, already replacing rotted beams with straightened pine from wagons that had arrived silently from the hills. The sheer coordination of it all stunned him. No one shouted orders. There were no maps or blueprints, just instinct. Unity. It was as if the land itself welcomed them, as if it had been waiting for their return. Nantan followed a step behind Elias, guiding him gently from group to group. At each stop, Elias asked the same question. What are they doing? And each time, Nantan answered with respect and clarity. They're cleansing the soil. They're rebuilding your well. They're setting posts for squash and beans. To Elias it was overwhelming. To the warriors, it was just a day's work. He paused near the well where 4 men had lifted the old wooden cover and were examining the mechanism inside. One turned and gave Elias a quick nod before dropping a stone tied to a rope down the shaft. When it hit water, a quiet smile spread across the man's weathered face. There's still life down there, Nantan said. Your well hasn't gone dry, just blocked. We'll clear it. Elias shook his head in disbelief. I thought it was finished. Nantan looked up at him. The land can sleep, but it does not forget. They moved on. By mid-morning, Elias saw fires being built on the far side of the property, controlled, purposeful blazes that released heat into the soil and cleansed it of blight. Near the barn, a group of younger warriors were laughing, hammering together a new feeding trough from lumber they had carried in. There was joy in their labor, not the weariness Elias had come to associate with farming, but pride, even celebration. For years, Elias had worked this land alone. Each furrow he dug had felt like a battle. The sun had been his only companion, the silence, his only answer. But now the land echoed with voices, not loud or rowdy, but full of harmony, of ancestral presence. The songs were sung in Apache, the meanings foreign to Elias, but the emotion carried through easily. This was sacred. The more Elias watched, the more he realized something deeper was happening. This wasn't just charity. It wasn't even just gratitude. This was ritual. They're not doing this just for me, are they? Elias asked quietly. Nantan looked at him, his eyes wise beyond his years. They're doing it for the ones who came before, and for the ones who will come after. Elias looked out over the scene. The earth turned, the sweat running down some backs, the quiet unity in motion. It was as if time had unraveled. For a brief moment, the modern world had vanished. There were no trains, no town hall meetings, no angry ranchers debating fences or borders. There was only the earth, being healed. By the hands that once knew it best, you knew they'd come, Elias said, almost to himself. Nantan nodded. They were already watching. I was the sign. Elias turned toward the boy. And what do you see now, Nantan? The boy looked across the fields, where his people moved like wind and water, quiet but unstoppable. I see balance being restored. Eli was quiet after that. What words could possibly match such a truth? By noon, the warriors had begun to plant seeds, were pressed into moist earth with reverence, and small prayer bundles tied to sticks were gently placed in the corners of the fields. The crops were chosen with intention. Corn, beans, squash, the 3 sisters, crops the Apache had planted for generations, now returned to the soil that once fed them. As the sun reached its peak, Elias sat under the old pecan tree at the edge of the field, his heart full in a way it hadn't been since his wife died. The land, the people, the rhythm of life, it was all returning, all breathing again. He looked out over his farm, no longer just a withering patch of land, but something holy, something alive. The earth remembered their hands, and, at long last, it opened itself to them again. As the day rolled on, the rhythm of work did not slow, it deepened. It became a dance between man and land, sun and shadow, sweat and soil. Elias Harper stood on the edge of it all, no longer just an observer but a man humbled by a force greater than himself. These weren't just hands tilling his land. They were reawakening something buried long before his grandfather's first fence post was hammered into the ground. It was my afternoon when the singing began again, soft and layered, like strands of wind through canyon walls. A group of women had arrived, their footsteps light, their eyes shining with the calm of people who knew the land by its spirit. Some came bearing baskets filled with seeds, others with bundles wrapped in deerskin. They weren't warriors, but they carried their own kind of strength, a strength woven through centuries of planting, preserving, and praying. Elias hadn't expected women or elders. He had assumed the men were the muscle, the front line, but here they were, the rest of the tribe, joining without fanfare, without ceremony. They walked the property as if it were familiar ground, even though most had likely never stepped foot here before. Still, they moved like they belonged. Nantan approached Elias again, his feet dusty, his brow lined with sun. "They've come to bring what was lost." Elias looked toward the approaching women. One carried a pot tall and earthen, decorated with symbols Elias didn't recognize but felt were older than language itself. She placed it gently near the edge of the freshly dug irrigation trench. Another woman, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, began setting stones in a pattern along the southern row. "What are they doing?" Elias asked, his voice quiet as if afraid to disturb the moment. Nantan smiled. "Planting stories." Elias blinked. "Stories." The boy nodded. "Seeds are stories. When we bury them, we remember who we are. When they grow, they retell the truth. We plant to feed the body, but also the spirit." Elias had never heard anything like that before. His whole life, farming had been a matter of survival, harsh, practical, unrelenting. Rows were rows. Soil was just a medium to carry food. But now he saw it all differently. Every hill and furrow looked sacred. Every movement had intention. Even the placement of each stone, each seed, was rooted in something deeper, something Elias had never been taught to see. A group of children arrived then, no older than 6 or 7, barefoot and curious. They giggled as they ran through the soft dust, dropping tiny seeds into small holes dug by their elders. A woman followed behind them, whispering blessings into the air as she gently covered the seeds with soil. The children listened, then mimicked her words, not perfectly, but earnestly. Elias's throat tightened. It had been so long since he'd seen children play on this land. His own daughter had once chased butterflies across the very same patch, where now a child was placing a bead-wrapped feather in the dirt beside a young corn sprout. It brought back memories that pressed into his chest like warm hands, memories of laughter, of life before the loneliness set in. And still, no one asked for anything in return. No one requested coin or contract. No one questioned ownership of the land. No one even looked at Elias with expectation. They simply gave their time, their hands, their wisdom, their stories. They gave as though it was the most natural thing in the world to offer healing to a stranger's land in return. For a meal to a starving boy, late in the afternoon, when shadows stretched long across the fields, Elias felt a quiet tapping on his elbow. He turned to find the tall elder who had first greeted him at dawn, the one who had called Nantan his grandson. "We will return soon," the man said simply. Elias blinked. "You're leaving?" "Not all, only some. The land has heard us. She will speak now, but she must be listened to carefully." Elias nodded slowly. "I'll listen." The man placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. "The earth does not belong to us. We belong to her. But when we care for her, she remembers." The sun slipped lower, painting the sky with swaths of amber and lavender. The day was ending, but Elias felt as though something far bigger had just begun. As the elders began to gather their things, and the children were led toward shaded wagons, Elias stood alone for a moment in the middle of his once failing farm, and for the first time in years, he felt it not just hope, belonging. The following morning came quietly, without the drama of the previous day's arrival. No thunder of hooves, no massive figures emerging through the mist, just soft light spilling across the earth, and the low rustle of wind through rows of soil that had, for the first time in years, been turned by willing hands. Elias Harper stepped out onto the porch before sunrise, coffee in hand, and looked over the fields. They were no longer empty, not just in the literal sense, but in spirit. Where before there had only been weeds and dust, there now stood fresh furrows, rows of newly planted corn and beans, and protective mounds where squash would soon sprout. Smoke still lingered from the fire pits the Apache warriors had used to cleanse the land, and something more subtle lingered to something Elias couldn't name. Nantan was already in the field, bare feet damp with morning dew, checking the rows like a young farmer. He moved methodically, hands brushing the soil, whispering words Elias could not understand but didn't need to. There was reverence in the boy's gestures, in how he stooped to adjust a stone marker or gently pat down loose earth around a tender sprout. He was no longer the starved teen Elias had found by the barn. He had become something rooted, transformed. As Elias approached him, Nantan looked up and smiled. "The land slept long," he said softly, "but she stirs now." Elias chuckled, then glanced around. Where did they all go? Back to the hills. Some will return when it's time to water, to tend. Others have left their blessings behind. Elias nodded. He felt it, the invisible threads tying him to something much older than himself. This farm had always been his burden, handed down from father to son like a tool worn smooth with use. He'd seen it only as a responsibility, a trap of dirt and drought. But now, for the first time, he saw it as something sacred, a gift. What happens next? He asked. Nantan stood and dusted off his hands. We wait, we listen. The land will tell us when she's ready. Elias took a deep breath. The air smelled different, cleaner, not because of any rain or wind, but because of what had happened here. This land had been blessed, not with gold or money, but with intention, sweat, memory, the kind of wealth men in cities never counted, because they never saw it. Do you think they'll really come back? Elias asked. Nantan gave him a long look, his eyes clear and certain. They never left, not truly. Their spirits have always walked this land. Yesterday, they showed themselves, in flesh, but even when you don't see them, they'll be here. There was something about the way the boy spoke that made Elias feel smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller, in the sense that he was just one man among generations. Larger, because now he was connected to something eternal. But later that morning, Elias found himself back in the barn, sweeping the floor, an old habit, but it didn't feel like drudgery anymore. The space had been transformed, tools were repaired and sorted. The old wheelbarrow had been replaced with a sturdier model, its wood still fragrant. A new saddle rested neatly on the wall, a quiet gift, likely left by one of the departing warriors. There was no note, no explanation, just the unspoken understanding that the exchange between them wasn't finished. He walked past the workbench and saw something folded carefully on top, a simple bundle of dried sage, 3 corn kernels wrapped in a red cloth, and a feather, possibly eagle. It was an offering, not to him, Elias realized, but for him to give back to the land. A symbol of trust. That afternoon, a soft rain fell. It came without thunder, without storm, just a gentle curtain of mist that kissed the fresh soil and soaked into the seeds, as if the sky itself had been watching and now gave its own approval. Elias stood in it, arms loose at his sides, eyes closed. For once, he didn't rush inside. He let the water soak into his shirt, run down his cheeks, and baptize him into this new beginning. He didn't know what the future held, whether the crops would flourish, whether this season would bring fortune or famine, but he knew this much: he was not alone anymore. His land had been seen, his kindness remembered, and his soul, in some quiet way, redeemed. That this was no longer just a farm, it was a story, one written in earth and blood and bread. It was only just beginning. Months passed, and the world turned as it always did. The sun carved its usual arc across the sky, and the seasons walked their ancient path from spring to summer, and from summer into the slow golden hush of autumn. But something on Elias Harper's land had changed, something deeper than what eyes alone could see. Where once the ground had cracked from drought, it now bore vibrant life. Rows of corn towered proudly, their stalks tall and green, tassels rustling like whispers in the breeze. Bean vines curled around sturdy wooden stakes with the eager reach of returning children, while plump squash nestled low to the earth like sleeping animals in the dust. The land had not just healed, it had thrived. Each morning, Elias rose before the light and walked the rows like a man with purpose in his bones. He tended the soil not out of duty but devotion. It was no longer about yields or profit, it was about partnership. He didn't just plant and water, he listened. He spoke softly to the seedlings, thanking them. And when he harvested, he did so with hands that moved slower now, gentler, careful not to break what had been given in trust. Nant came often, sometimes alone, sometimes with other boys his age, learning under the wide sky. Other times, elders returned, bringing herbs Elias had never seen, telling stories in the shade about mountains and rivers and ancestors who once knew the names of every star. Elias didn't understand all the words, but he listened anyway, because he knew it mattered, because he knew listening was a kind of planting too. One cool morning in late September, Nantan brought Elias a bundle of woven cloth. Inside were roasted corn cakes, smoked meat, and small fruit preserved in honey. He handed it over with quiet pride. For the harvest, he said, and for the man who helped me when I had nothing. Elias looked down at the bundle, then back at the boy who had everything. He replied, I was the one empty. Nantan grinned, not anymore. That day, they held a small ceremony. There were no invitations, no announcements in the town, no men in pressed suits or women in frilly dresses, just a quiet gathering. A fire was lit at the edge of the cornfield. Songs were sung in Apache and English, mingling in the air like the smoke that curled toward the rising sun. Children laughed. Elders told stories. Women laid food on blankets spread over the grass, and Elias, standing among them all, finally felt what he had missed all those lonely years: community, not the kind measured by church pews or banknotes, but by kindness, by memory, by the way hands reached out for one another without needing to ask. When the sun began to set, an old Apache woman approached Elias with a carved stick in hand, was smooth, polished, and etched with symbols he couldn't read but could feel. She placed it in his hand and said something soft in her native tongue. Nantan translated, she says this is a seed stick. Used by her grandfather, she gives it to you because you helped plant more than crops. You helped plant trust. Elias could barely speak. He clutched the stick like a lifeline. No one had ever thanked him like this. Not with trinkets or trophies, but with truth. That night, as the stars spread across the open sky like spilled diamonds, Elias sat on his porch with a blanket over his knees, the seed stick beside him. The sounds of laughter drifted from the field where a few families still lingered, telling stories under the moon. Nantan sat on the steps, his head resting on his arms, his eyes watching the sky. "Do you think your people will stay?" Elias asked after a long silence. The boy looked at him. Some will go, but all will remember." Elias nodded slowly. "That's enough for me." They sat together like that for a long time to lives once strangers, now tied together by something deeper than blood, by bread shared in hunger, by a field reborn, by the choice to see a starving boy not as a danger, but as a son of the same earth. And when Elias finally rose to go inside, he paused and looked back at the land, now cloaked in moonlight. It glowed, not with gold, but with something far richer, with the harvest of the heart.